Hi guys, it's Shane Wellman from Wellman Audio. Welcome to part 2 of the video series, Perfecting a Multi-Track Mix Using the 3 T's Approach. And make sure that you've already watched part 1 before you watch this video. In part 1, I described the concept of the 3 T's approach, so make sure that you have part 1 under your belt before watching this video. Anyway, where we left off, we finished the drums, so now it's time to move on to the other foundational instruments. So for me, the next on my list is bass guitar. You don't necessarily have to do the bass next. As long as the drums are done, it doesn't really matter. But for this song, I want to establish the rhythm section as much as possible first. So step 1, timing. We need to get this bass track in time. Well, unlike the drums, the best approach for fixing timing on stringed instruments or vocals is not usually chopping and moving. This can actually cause many problems, which we talk about more in the Elite Audio Recording course. Usually for instruments that are not percussion, the best approach to fixing timing is to warp audio. So I'm going to double click on the bass track and enter the audio editor. And in the audio editor, I'm going to place what are called warp tabs on my individual notes. And you can see where these different notes happen because the shape of the wave changes. You'll get used to looking at that and identifying individual notes. And once we have some warp tabs in place, we can just begin to move each note in time with the metronome grid. And now you're just going to repeat the process through the entire track. And yeah, this is time consuming, but who cares? It's working. In order to effectively mix audio, you've got to become patient. Good results don't happen easily. If they did, everyone would do it. And yeah, some software can do this automatically for you, but for this video series, I'm trying to show you the most universal techniques that work on the most basic software. If you want to learn more about time correction, make sure you check out the Elite Audio Recording course. It's available for Apple devices on the iOS App Store or the Mac App Store, or you can get it in universal format from wellmanaudio.com. Okay, so I went through and I warped everything to get it in time. And here's a little bit of the results. Now that the bass is in time, we need to address the tuning. Well, luckily the tuning on the bass track is not really an issue. The guitar was in tune from the start, so that helps tremendously. However, if tuning was an issue, you have a couple of options. One, you can try pitch correction. Sometimes that works. And I will show you pitch correction, but that's in the next video. We're going to save that for later. Or your other option is you can manually replace sections that are bad or out of tune or that cause problems for whatever reason. In the last video, we talked about drum replacement. Well, wouldn't it be nice if there was a way to do instrument replacement other than just on drums? Well, to some degree, we can. Yeah, sure, there might not be a plugin that will do it automatically like a drum replacer would, but we can kind of do this manually. For instance, with this style of song, the guitar might play the verse progression several times, or it might play the choruses several times. So in the event that a wrong note was played, or that a section sounds out of tune or whatever, we can sometimes grab a different audio clip of a progression or a chord or a single note that happened later in the song or at a different section in the song, and we can replace our bad audio with the good audio simply by copying and pasting. And then once we do that, it's easy to splice all these pieces back together by crossfading, just like we did with the drums. So even though we technically only have one guitar performance, we usually have repeats of every section played throughout the song, and we can sometimes use those repeat sections to repair the bad sections. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go through this song and repair any bad audio sections that I find. This technique can be so useful for so many different instruments in so many different situations. It's very good to know about. So now step 1 and 2 are done. We've got the timing and we've got the tuning. All that is left is step 3, tone. Bass tone is usually pretty easy to fix, and that's another reason why I wanted to do bass first before we move on to other guitars. And why is bass easier to fix? Well, because most of the time, bass is ran direct to the mixing board, especially when recorded live. So it's usually recorded fairly clean. And that's not to say that the tone or the amp setting was clean. Like in this case, the bass sound was actually set to be a little distorted or overdriven. But it's still a direct recording. We didn't mic up the amp, so it's not like there's going to be a whole bunch of background noise or instrument bleed. So a lot of times, the tone on a recording like this doesn't even need a whole lot of work. But if it does, we can easily fix it up in a couple different ways. In this case, since the bass recording already had an affected sound, we may just need to add a touch-up compression or an EQ setting. But that's not what I'm going to show you right now because we've already talked about EQ, and we're going to go into compression a little bit more later on. Instead, right now, I want to show you an alternate way of fixing bass tone. In this particular case, because the bass is already a little distorted or overdriven, I probably wouldn't use this method on this particular track. But a lot of times, a direct bass recording is of a very clean sounding bass. So here's a way to bring some realistic and lively amp tone to a clean sounding bass recording. We could use an amp simulator. Now, with an amp simulator, I can just dial in a clean bass's tone by selecting the right amplifier, the right cabinet, and the right amp setting. So rather than trying to EQ or affect a clean bass's recording somehow, I sometimes find it better to simulate a bass amplifier, or even re-amp a bass's track using a real amp in the studio. And this could make the recording sound a lot more lively and real, and far less direct recording, if you know what I mean. And this is something we talk about in more detail in the audio course. So there you have it, bass and drums. Now let's move on to guitars. The techniques that apply to one instrument usually apply to several instruments. And that's the beauty about mixing. Once you begin to understand audio, you realize that you don't need to learn a whole new set of sciences to record and mix every single instrument. You just apply the techniques that you already have in your toolbox to do the task at hand. So with that in mind, I can say that fixing up guitars is very much like fixing up the bass. So we're going to move very quickly through the guitars. On the lead guitar, I want to fix up timing by warping audio. To fix up the tuning, yeah, sometimes I can pitch correct, but a more reasonable solution is to usually do what we did with the bass guitar. We can fix tuning issues or mistakes simply by replacing bad audio by copying and pasting the good audio that I find elsewhere in the track. But I'm not going to waste a bunch of time showing you that whole process again. But what I really want to introduce you to in this section on fixing guitars is a new approach to fixing tone. Do you remember back in the first video, I mentioned that as beginners, when we notice a problem with the mix, we tend to assume that the problem is directly related to tone. So we try to EQ it out or process it out or whatever. But a lot of times, the problem has nothing to do with EQ. Well, along those same lines, there is another factor that directly affects tone, and this is dimension. And seriously, guys, this is one of the most important parts about achieving good instrument recordings. The understanding of how dimension affects tone and how to properly capture it. In fact, I felt it was so important that I'm giving it away for free just to help you guys out. So seriously, guys, I know I've been mentioning the Elite Audio Recording course a lot throughout this series, but if you don't want to buy it or can't afford it or whatever, go to the iOS App Store and download the free version. It's called the Elite Audio Recording course, free. Pretty logical. It'll give you so many of the full lesson videos for free. And I also decided to include the full mono stereo lecture that explains dimension and how to properly capture it. There's just a ton of useful information that I know will help you out just in the free course. But getting back to guitars, Here's the problem. We didn't capture the guitars in such a way that has good dimension. Channels are usually limited in a church situation, or microphones are limited, or whatever, so all the guitars are just mono-mic'd. So what we are dealing with are purely mono recordings of the guitars. But this leaves our recording sounding very narrow and dimensionless, and this is one of the main reasons that I hate mono recordings with a passion. But regardless, it's what we have to work with. So let's just do what we can do. And in fact, what I can do is I can simulate a stereo recording from my mono recordings. And here's how. And you're going to learn all the hows and whys this works in the audio course, or even the free audio course. So I'm not really going to explain the science behind this too much. I'm just going to demonstrate it. Let's start by duplicating my guitar track so that I have two channels of the same mono guitar. And then I'm going to pan one of those channels all the way left, and I'm going to pan the other one all the way right. At this point, the results are not going to sound any different than my original mono recording, because still, the same thing is playing out of both speakers. But now if I were to alter the phase between these two tracks by slowing down one of these tracks slightly, not much, maybe 10 to 12 milliseconds, here's a before and after. Do you hear how much wider the recording became? And I didn't use any fancy stereo widener plugin or anything like that, just good old-fashioned know-how. In fact, I don't even like most stereo widening plugins anyway. Usually the negative consequences far outweigh the benefits you get from using those kinds of plugins. So really, there is no substitute for just understanding stereo recordings and how stereo imaging works. And I'm telling you, that kind of knowledge is going to be your best friend. This technique that we use to simulate a stereo recording can also be used to help out on many styles of instruments and even vocals. But anyway, here's our mix so far with the drums, bass, and guitars. You hear how much better the tone of the guitars are? And we didn't even really do anything, except we fixed the dimension. So you can begin to see how much the dimension affects the tone. And this video is almost done, but before we end, I just want to talk briefly about the keyboard recording. So let's talk about keyboards real quick. In the studio, if I was recording a keyboard, I would always record it as a MIDI track. MIDI offers so much more flexibility that the editing you can do with MIDI tracks are just unbelievable. So even if that MIDI track was just going to be used to control the same keyboard that it originated from, I would still start by capturing a MIDI track. And this is something that I do talk about in great detail in the Elite Audio Recording course, because it's just so important, especially in modern music. However, on this live recording, we didn't have the luxury of a MIDI recording. So we just do what we can do. And the same techniques of guitar recording applies. First, fix the timing by warping notes or replacing sections. And as far as tuning, well, if you're using a keyboard, tuning shouldn't be an issue. But wrong notes could be an issue. So you could fix those mistakes by replacing them with audio sections elsewhere in the song, just like you did with all the other instruments. And as far as the last step goes, the tone, if at all possible, whenever you can't record a keyboard as a MIDI track, if you could at least record the keyboard in stereo, well, that's going to help you out tremendously. Many people don't realize that good sounding keyboards are stereo samples. And by bridging those stereo samples to mono, even though the keyboard may allow it or have an option for a mono out, it's not usually a good idea. In fact, many stereo samples are not even mono compatible, so recording them as mono may cause things like phase cancellation, and at the very least just a ton of dimension loss and tone loss. But worst case scenario, if the world is ending and all you have to work with is a mono recording of a stereo keyboard, you can try to bring out some dimension by doing what we did before, artificially creating some sort of stereo image, just like we did with the guitars. But this is a worst case, break the glass scenario. It's something that you want to try to avoid. So after you complete all your fixes, the only thing left with the keyboard tone is to maybe add a little compression. And this is to level out the track because keyboards and pianos are usually very expressive. And here's our instrument mix so far. Hopefully by now you've noticed a couple things. A lot of these techniques are lather, rinse, and repeat, meaning that they are the same things over and over, just applied to different instruments. And also I hope that you've noticed that a lot of our mixing hasn't even needed a lot of EQ or compression or effecting. By now I hope you're realizing that a good mix doesn't always have to have a bunch of effects or stuff on it. A good mix is made up of good sounding instruments. And that's essentially what we are creating here with a 3 T's approach. We are creating good instrument performances, good instrument takes that didn't originally exist. But now here's food for thought. How much better would our results be if we started with great sounding instruments and great captures? Imagine how much better it would be and how much more we could do if we started our recordings properly rather than sitting here trying to fix everything as an afterthought. And that is what will set you apart as a producer or an engineer. If you understand how to start strong and how to finish strong. And that's what I really want to show you in the Elite Audio Recording course. So guys, make sure you check it out. It's on the App Store, or you can get the audio course from wellmanaudio.com, or at least grab the free version from the iOS App Store. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the last video of this video series. We will be mixing vocals.